There's something the matter with seagulls, Richard Bach wrote in 1959. They're very manoeuvrable, have well-proportioned wings, rugged construction, and they might almost have been designed for aerobatic flight, and yet apparently they lack the instinct or the inspiration and live out their lives using no more than the basic aerial skills learned in the first few hours of flight. It was a theme that preoccupied Bach, and one he returned to a decade later with his best-selling book Jonathan Livingston's Seagull. But in 1927, while Charlie Myers dreamed of building an aerobatic Waco 10, Clay Bruckner regarded aerobatics as an expensive distraction from the business of building aircraft. It was, he might have said, strictly for the birds. The Advanced Aircraft Company led the field with its Waco 10, now renamed the GXE, thanks largely to the persistence and collective vision of Bruckner, Myers and Sam Junkin. Buck Weaver, the W in Waco, had left the company in 1924, but not before contributing his own sweat and blood. Waco's first aircraft almost killed him. Now these were young men, they're all in their early 20s, and it has to be said their early efforts had been characterised as much by enthusiasm and wildly inflated product claims as by actual delivered products. But somehow these were tempered with just enough ingenuity and good fortune to help define the market they were trying to break into. Bruckner and Junkin had worked together at Curtiss, and Bruckner's restraint in matters of business paid off as they refined the early Waco designs to wring better performance out of those cheap Curtiss engines, and without blowing such profits as they were on development costs. One thing Bruckner had to admit, though, was the importance of competition, and it was its performance in the first Ford National Air Tour that had really gotten the Model 9 the audience it needed. The Ford Air Tours were really the forum where competing aircraft manufacturers sent their aircraft up against each other for the Ford Reliability Trophy. The Model 9 comfortably outperformed the war surplus Curtiss Jennies, and at a price common folks could afford to pay, and once they noticed it, the 9 was a hit. Bruckner's business instinct, of course, was to keep churning out the 9s, but Charlie Myers, recognising that the 9 would inevitably be overtaken in such a dynamic marketplace, pushed him to develop an all-new aircraft, the Model 10. Even with the 10 or GXE selling well, Myers continued to push for innovation, which led to a number of engine options, and notably the Wright J5 powered ASO. What he really wanted, though, was for Bruckner to approve a tapered wing design. Myers was an experienced barnstormer in his own right, of course, and he knew that a more aggressive wing profile would add a bit of sparkle to the fairly sedate handling of the GXE. And although he eventually persuaded Bruckner to let him build a set of tapered wings for a standard GXE, this served mainly to highlight the woeful performance of that Curtiss OX5 engine. Meanwhile, the company continued to enter its aircraft in the Ford Reliability Tours, and the ASO proved itself as a formidable competition machine. In 1928, Waco took first place with an ASO flown by John Wood, while Charlie Myers placed fourth at another Wright-powered Waco. Wood and Myers were convinced that these high-profile successes were crucial to the company, and they finally persuaded Bruckner to fund a set of Wright-powered tapered wing specials for the competition circuit. 3 aircraft were authorised. 2 of these were ASOs retrofitted with tapered wings. The third, which was the first purpose-built taper wing, went to Johnny Livingston, a successful Waco dealer and factory test pilot. Livingston was an accomplished aerobatic and competition pilot. He'd gone to win the 1929 Ford Reliability Trophy for Waco, and 40 years later he'd have a seagull named after him. So less than 100 of these taper wings were built by the factory, and the majority were Wright J5 powered aircraft designated ATO, T for tapered wings, and with the later CTO powered by the Wright J6. The aircraft modelled here was actually built in 2003 by Roy Redmond's Rare Aircraft Limited. From original plans, this technically makes it a replica, hence the R suffix, but aside from the Jacobs R755 engine, which was used in later Wacos, and the modern panel, it's every bit a classic Waco. So in flight, this aircraft's a lot twitchier than its straight wing cousins. It lacks the short field performance due to the higher wing loading, and it drinks like a fish. It's also not that much faster than the ASO, even with all that streamlining and taping over the draggy bits. But from the start, the taper wing did one thing very, very well, and for the next 20 years it would dominate competition aerobatics. It was the most coveted ride there was. Now, I'm not much of an aerobatic pilot, so I'll have to leave a detailed critique of this aircraft performance for another day. Compared to flying the straight wing, Wacos, the CTO is a bit of a handful in the circuit. What we can dismiss as twitchy in the cruise becomes positively unstable in the approach and landing, and we need to keep very good control of the speed on the way in. Now this is particularly true for trying to get into a short strip because the Taperwing wants to go fast, and that rapid drag increase in the flare isn't quite as pronounced as the straight wings. It will side slip to dump height, of course, but even here it seems less controllable, and it's harder to get it to stay sideways without wanting to turn. These are all consequences of a design that's deliberately slippery, of course, and the result's always going to be a compromise. The Taperwings never really became production items, and most were manufactured to special order. They weren't exclusively competition aircraft. They also saw service in other roles, such as carrying the mail. There were even a handful of armed versions produced for export. Now, all the aircraft we've seen so far were pretty much parallel developments as Waco felt out the market in the late 20s and early 30s. And we'll see more of that in part 4 as we take a look at the genesis of the aircraft that would soon replace the GXE as Waco's general purpose biplane.